Welcome to my channel. Make sure you hit the like button, share, and subscribe. This is part 5 of the Boobie Boys. Jeff Lewis and Officer Tony signed Mario Frazier out of the Miami-Dade County stockade and brought him to the homicide office. He was at the stockade awaiting trial on theft charges. Jeff took a sworn statement from him regarding the triple murder he witnessed on the Palmetto Expressway, in which E4 and Boobie shot and killed 3 members of Vonda's gang. The lead detective on that case, Juan Capote, was out of state on an investigative trip and asked that the statement be taken. While talking to Frazier, they also discovered that he and his mother were eyewitnesses to the double murder at the Amoco gas station. He positively identified E4 from photos as one of the participants. Later that day, Jeff located Frazier's mother, who corroborated her son's story and also positively identified E4 from a photo lineup. In late March, they learned that detectives from the Warrants Bureau had arrested Vonda Jackson. She had been booked into the Women's Detention Center on 7th Avenue and was awaiting transfer to the Federal Detention Center by the U.S. Marshals. Officer Tony talked to Vonda at length that evening. She was cordial but cagey. She agreed to talk to him but was very careful with her answers. Officer Tony took 10 pages of notes on a legal pad, but very little of it was useful. What he did accomplish, however, was to get her to admit that she knew all the players. This would be helpful for the impending federal RICO case. Vonda did reveal a couple of tidbits. She said that when her 3 friends were shot and killed on the Palmetto Expressway, the lone survivor, Andre McWhorter, aka Bam, saw the killers without their masks. Bam said he played dead when Boobie and E4 came to the car to finish them off. He said he saw their faces clearly, but did not tell the police. Vonda also talked a lot about the docks and how easy it was to smuggle narcotics into the port. She said she and her whole family were longshoremen, and her father, who was head of the Longshoremen's Union, was about to retire. She explained that any successful smuggling operation required the complicity of a gantry operator. A gantry is a crane that is used to move sealed shipping containers. If a container contains kilos of cocaine, the gantry operator can move it to avoid inspection by U.S. Customs agents, or place it in a hidden area where the narcotics can be secretly unloaded. Vonda said that just recently a gantry operator named Lionel Porter had stolen 80 kilos from a shipment. The Colombian who the kilos were meant for came to Lionel's house in Carroll City and put a gun in his mother's mouth, threatening to blow her brains out of the top of her head. Lionel returned the 80 kilos. Vonda also told him that Moose was at the Amoco murders and that he cut his dreadlocks off the next day because of the news reports. According to Vonda, the twins were calling Moose soft and a coward because he didn't seek revenge after he was shot. The twins were relentless with their abuse, calling him soft as cotton and a PUSSY. So he agreed to participate in the Amoco murders to show he had heart. Vonda did admit to Officer Tony that it was Rara and Famous who shot Moose, but she would not concede that she ordered the hit. The next to go down was E4. He was arrested by MDPD detectives and ATF agents who pounced on him as he left his house. He was charged with federal firearms violations stemming from the chase in the city in which several weapons were ejected from the vehicle. He was brought to the homicide office and interviewed by Jeff and DEA agent Lenny Athis, but refused to talk without a lawyer. He did agree to provide background about himself, though. He said he dropped out of Miami Central High School in the 10th grade and in 1989 married Keatrona Johnson. They had 4 children together, Naima, age 5, Naisha, age 4, Ephraim Jr., age 3, and Ephraim, age 2. He stated that his only source of income was a lawn-cutting business called E&D Landscaping. Jeff noticed that E4 was covered with numerous tattoos on his arms, legs, chest, and back, so he summoned a crime scene tech to take close-up color photographs of them. An elaborate tattoo covered his entire back that portrayed an open Bible emblazoned with 2 Bible verses. No weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their righteousness is of me, saith the Lord. That is Isaiah 54, verse 17. Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. Thou hast enlarged me when I was in distress. Have mercy upon me, and hear my prayer. O ye sons of men, how long will ye turn my glory into shame? That is from Psalms 4, verses 1 through 8. It was a magnificent piece of artwork, intricate and ornate. Just above the Bible was the face of Jesus, wearing a crown of thorns. It revealed a complete dichotomy between E4's gangster lifestyle and his Catholic upbringing. E4 had $10,000 in cash in his pocket at the time of his arrest. E4 had $10,000 in cash in his pockets at the time of his arrest. A police canine alerted on the money as having cocaine residue on it, and it was seized. It was later learned that the $10,000 was to be used as bond money for fellow Boobie boy Zeus Wilson, who had been in jail for selling cocaine. E4 claimed he won the money gambling, and it was to be used to pay off his mortgage. 3 days later, E4 was charged with assaulting one of the corrections officers at the Federal Detention Center. Cheryl Palmer, an investigator for the Bureau of Prisons, asked Officer Tony to come to her office, where she showed him a videotape of E4 punching and kicking one of the guards. E4 and 2 other prisoners had barricaded themselves into a cell, and when officers broke through the barricade and entered the cell, E4 attacked them. As punishment, E4 was sent to the special housing unit known as the SHU, pronounced SHU, or the Hole. The SHU is the lowest, worst possible existence in the federal prison system. The inmate is confined to a 7x9 cell with only a toilet, sink, and bunk. All privileges are taken away or severely cut back. TV, radio, and books are not allowed. Meals are served on a tray that is pushed through a slot in the steel door. There is no communication with other prisoners. It is a miserable punishment, and most inmates don't do well mentally in the SHU. While there, Officer Tony asked Cheryl if he could look at E4's file. In it, he discovered a lot of material that would be useful in the upcoming RICO charge. During questioning by booking officers, E4 admitted his close association with Boobie and insisted that he be kept separate from any member of Vonda's crew. The booking officer wrote down his exact words. I'm a member of the Boobie Boys gang. We're at war with Vonda's gang. Vonda's people have tried to kill me 7 times. I need to be kept away from Vonda's people. Shortly after E4's arrest, Mike Hernandez and Officer Tony picked up their new CI, Roderick, and brought him to the homicide office. They showed him the video that captured the murder of John Davis at the 79th Street one-stop store. Without hesitating, he said, "That's the twins, Bo and Nard." He also told them that Nard had a severe heart condition, requiring that he go to Jackson Memorial Hospital once a month, every month, and receive a life-sustaining shot. The North End Task Force had been in existence for less than 3 months, and they had already been able to arrest or secure arrest warrants for the most vicious members in each criminal organization. Boobie and Rara were wanted for federal firearms violations. E4, Vonda, and Famous Johnson were in custody, and the twins, Bo and Nard Brown, had been indicted for murder. Overall, they were pleased with their initial results, but there was still more work to be done. Officer Tony was immersed in reviewing a suicide report one afternoon when Captain Butler wandered into his cubicle and sat on the corner of his desk. The third floor wants you to give Gail Epstein from the Miami Herald an interview about the Boobie Boys case, he said. Officer Tony was stunned. He tossed his pen onto his desk and said, "Captain, just 2 months ago, we had a sergeant's meeting where we were told not to talk to Gail Epstein under any circumstances. We were told she was not to be trusted and to always refer her to the Public Information Office. Never talk to her," the lieutenant said. He nodded his head vigorously. I know, but things have apparently changed. She has the director's ear now, and he wants her to have full access to any information about this gang war. "Captain, this is a really bad idea," Officer Tony said. "It's going to hurt our investigation by publicizing what we are doing." "I agree, but it's been decided." "Okay," Officer Tony said, "but this is not going to be good." He couldn't have been more wrong. 2 days later, Officer Tony sat in the homicide conference room with Gail Epstein and showed her the same slide presentation he had given to the command staff in February. He was amazed by how much she already knew. She had been conducting her own investigation and interviewing the family members of many of the homicide victims. Officer Tony confirmed a lot of what she had already uncovered. Her article was published in the Sunday edition of the Herald on Mother's Day, May 10, 1998, and it was a blockbuster. It took up 2 complete pages and gave every sordid detail of the conflict between the two groups. When the morning edition hit the streets, the article caused a huge furor in Overtown, Carroll City, and the rest of Miami-Dade County. After the word spread, the first printing sold out in minutes. The Herald press room rushed out 2 more printings to keep up with the demand, but they sold out just as quickly. People were driving as far as Palm Beach County and Homestead to buy copies. The headline read, "Deadly Gang Wars," in large red letters. The front page showed color photos of Boobie, Vonda, E4, Rara, the twins, Marvin Rogers, Zeus, and Famous Johnson. There was also a map showing the location of the murders and shootings. It was quite impressive. The first 8 paragraphs set the tone of the article. With deadly regularity, dueling drug traffickers outfitted with AK-47s are marking their territory with indiscriminate barrages of unstoppable firepower. As many as 100 shootings appear to be linked to a handful of warring drug factions in Miami-Dade, police say. Take or be taken. It's the law of the street. It's also the credo that has turned the drive-by shooting into a horrific art form in Miami-Dade's poorest inner-city neighborhoods. But now the hammer is dropping. In surgical strikes that started 2 weeks ago, police and prosecutors are using federal firearm indictments in an attempt to dismantle the leadership ranks of Miami-Dade's most violent drug gangs. Convictions would mean long federal prison sentences and the promise of serious charges, including murder, down the road. The foremost goal is saving lives. We've had an artificially inflated murder rate as these guys shot it out, said Frank Boney, Assistant Chief for Miami-Dade Police. I think now the murder rate will drop down. That prediction would be welcome news to thousands of beleaguered inner-city residents routinely forced to duck and dive from gunfire, said State Representative Kendrick Meek, who had pushed police to reclaim every hostile street. These guys are selling drugs. It's their kingdom, Meek said, during a recent tour of Liberty City's worst drug spots. You've got 1% of the people holding the rest of the community hostage, and they are brutal. AK-47s, 9mm. The casualties are in the drug trade, but innocent people died too. Further down in the article, Epstein explained the strategy. The U.S. Attorney's Officer agreed to file firearms charges under federal law. Both alleged gang leaders were indicted in April, along with 3 of their alleged lieutenants. Police arrested Vonda Jackson, but Boobie Williams is believed to have fled the state and is still being sought. On conviction, the firearm charge carries a minimum mandatory sentence of 10 years. It can be made even longer for violent career criminals. The article ended with the tease, coming Monday, the families affected by the gang violence. The article turned out to be a bombshell. It ignited a firestorm in South Florida. As soon as the first edition hit the streets on Mother's Day, the phone in the homicide office began ringing off the hook. The 3 homicide detectives who were working were deluged with calls from people who professed to have information about both groups. One of them called Officer Tony at home. "You need to get in here with their squad right away, Sarge," he said. "We can't handle all these calls." And it didn't stop. The volume of calls decreased over time, but for the next 2 years, they continued to receive call after call from witnesses willing to help. Many of them were inmates or the family members of inmates who wanted their sentences reduced through cooperation. Dozens of family members in Miami clipped out the Miami Herald article and mailed it to their relatives imprisoned in federal facilities. Inmates from South Florida passed it around on the yard to other inmates. They were getting hundreds of calls and letters from convicts willing to testify against the Boobie Boys or Vonda's gang. Why would anyone in federal prison jeopardize being labeled a snitch, agree to testify in open court, and risk retaliation from other prisoners, you might ask? The answer, a Rule 35. Federal prison sentences are known to be severe, harsh in fact. 30 to 40-year stretches, even life sentences for trafficking in narcotics are common. According to the guidelines, a person commits the crime of federal drug trafficking when he or she manufactures, distributes, dispenses, or possesses with intent to manufacture, distribute, or dispense any amount of a prohibited controlled substance. The U.S. Sentencing Guidelines considers 3 primary factors in drug crimes: whether the offense harmed another person, whether there was a weapon involved, and the criminal history of the defendant. Any person involved in the importation or exportation of controlled substances is subject to a penalty of 5, 10, or 20 years, or even life imprisonment, with fines starting at $2 million and can reach as high as $20 million. Federal drug or violent crimes involving the use of a firearm require stiff mandatory minimum sentencing, with 5 to 10 years being added to the underlying offense when the defendant is a first offender, and 25 years when the defendant is a second offender. If the firearm is a machine gun or destructive device, and the firearm is equipped with a silencer, 30 years is added to the underlying offense. And if the defendant is a second offender, a life sentence is added. 80% of all federal defendants facing a mandatory minimum sentence stand convicted of a drug crime. A mandatory minimum sentence for a federal drug crime imposes a binding prison term for no less than a specific period of time. That is, no parole and no early release for good behavior. In the state courts, federal trafficking would be considered mere possession. With the feds, it can be life-altering. When convicted federally, most people are shocked to learn just how crushing the sentence guidelines are. For many, their only hope of ever seeing freedom again is a Rule 35. The Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 35B allows offenders who cooperate with the government to receive credit for the substantial assistance they provide in the arrest and prosecution of another person. Generally, a request must be filed within 1 year of sentencing, but if the defendant could not have reasonably anticipated that the information in question would be useful until more than a year after sentencing, the 1 year requirement is waived. If the prosecuting United States attorney and the sentencing judge agree that the assistance the defendant has given is substantial, the defendant's sentence may be reduced. On the outside, these criminals would vow to each other that they would never rat, that they would be soldiers, true to the streets and true to the game. But once they were inside, it was a different story. Faced with the prospect of dying in prison, they all agreed to spill their guts. There were so many in federal prison who were cooperating with authorities that informers were no longer stigmatized or attacked. The story in the Miami Herald and the Federal Rule 35 undeniably changed the entire direction of their whole investigation. While they were previously scrounging for witnesses and begging them to come forward, they now had more witnesses than they could handle. On May 11th, the day after Gail Epstein's story appeared in the Miami Herald newspaper, Corey Muckerson, who was also known as Fish Grease, was murdered in Titusville, a small town 200 miles north of Miami. Joe Mallet spoke to his cousin, Kimberly Cohen, the next day. She said that just before Fish Grease was killed, he had read the article about the Miami gang violence in the Sunday edition of the Herald. After reading it, he seemed visibly upset, and his cousin asked him what was wrong. He said simply, "There's a bunch of mess going on in Miami. I made my bed, and now I gotta lay in it." A few minutes later, he walked out of the front door of her apartment and was gunned down. He was shot multiple times by a gunman dressed in dark clothing and wearing a nylon stocking as a mask. Fish Grease had only arrived at the apartment a few hours earlier, so his cousin speculated that he must have been followed. Services for Fish Grease were held in Miami at the Brownsville Baptist Church on the following Saturday. At the funeral, several family members were overheard angrily accusing Boobie and the twins of complicity in Fish Grease's death. Overcome with grief, they loudly proclaimed that Boobie considered Fish Grease a weak link and that he was murdered by Boobie to shut him up. They even alleged that following the murder, Boobie and the twins went to nearby Disney World and were spotted there by friends of the Muckerson family. This was reported to the task force months later by informants, but none of the family ever voiced their suspicions to the Titusville police. Fish Grease and Boobie have been friends since elementary school. When Boobie rose to power and took over the Matchbox projects, Fish Grease was right by his side. He was a loyal follower of Boobie for over a decade, but those who knew him said there was no doubt that for his own self-preservation, Boobie would not hesitate to do away with one of his closest homeboys if he thought it was necessary. Fish Grease's murder has never been solved. 1 week after the Herald article was published, Officer Tony received a phone call from Assistant United States Attorney Fernando Gruesome from the Eastern District of Virginia in Norfolk. He said that he was in the process of putting together a continuing criminal enterprise, which is a RICO, case regarding Richard Thomas Stitt, aka Death. Stitt, as you will recall, was one of the suspected shooters in the double homicide at the Amico gas station. He and his girlfriend also rented the getaway vehicle using the alias Errol Joseph. Gruesome said that he was preparing to indict at least a dozen defendants, charging them with numerous violations of federal narcotics and firearms laws and drug-related murders. His plan was to include 8 murders in the CCE that occurred in the Norfolk-Portsmouth area. He went on to say that he currently had enough evidence and testimony to include Boobie and many of his cohorts in the indictment. One of those he intended to add was Jason Ortega, a close friend of Boobie. He planned to charge Ortega with at least 3 murders. He aimed to seek the death penalty for both Stitt and Ortega. In discussions he had with Ortega's attorney, he was confident that Ortega would agree to testify against Stitt if he were indicted to avoid the death penalty. Gruesome said he anticipated presenting the case to the grand jury within the next 30 days, but would like to meet with the North End Task Force and AUSA Chris Clark before he did. Officer Tony told him they were putting together a similar CCE case on the Boobie boys, and he said, "I don't want to step on your toes down there. If you have enough to charge Boobie and his people, it would make more sense to indict them in Miami. I have enough on my plate right now with defendants who are from Virginia." Before they hung up, Gruesome agreed to fly to Miami and meet with the task force to share information and hammer out a strategy. He said he would bring his 2 lead investigators, Detective Tammy Early from the Portsmouth Police Department and Special Agent Hugh Roseger of the FBI. 1 week later, Officer Tony picked up the 3 of them at Miami International Airport and drove them to the homicide office. They spent the next 2 days in the conference room brainstorming and dividing the cases. They all got along great. There was no bickering or any territorial disputes. Their goal was to put as many of those thugs in federal prison for the rest of their lives. AUSA Gruesome was particularly interested in the double murder at the Amico gas station because of the similarities to one of the cases he intended to include in his CCE. In the Virginia murder, a stolen car was used and dumped a block away. There, the killers got into a vehicle rented by Stitt's girlfriend, Tanika Stringer, just like in the Amico murders. Because of the similarities, Gruesome immediately issued a grand jury subpoena for Tanika Stringer, who rented the vehicle used in the Amico case. He asked that members of the North End Task Force locate Stringer and serve her with the subpoena. 2 weeks later, AUSA Gruesome called and told Officer Tony that he had secured the indictments. As expected, Jason Ortega quickly pleaded guilty and agreed to testify against Stitt, aka Death, and all the others named in the CCE. During a debriefing with the FBI, Ortega told them that he and Stitt had worked directly for Boobie and Darrell Green in their Virginia operation since the early 90s. He went on to say that Darrell Green had recently been convicted in Pensacola by the DEA and was serving a life sentence in federal prison. He also revealed some stunning new information. From prison, Death, Richard Stitt, was conspiring to have witnesses against him killed. Right after they were arrested, they were in the same lockup for several days, and Stitt told Ortega, "Hang tight. Boobie is going to clean this up for us. There won't be any witnesses left to testify." He told Ortega that he had to be stand up and that if anyone came forward against them, Boobie would have their families killed. He said confidently, "Boobie can reach out and get anyone." Stitt said that Boobie still had shooters out there who would take care of business. Two names he specifically mentioned were Leonard Albury, aka Shotout, and Chantel Shea, aka Red Boy. According to Stitt, both were fanatically loyal to Boobie and would do anything he asked, including kill witnesses. Ortega also revealed that for the past year, Stitt knew he was being investigated. In August of 1997, he summoned Jason Ortega and Jason Davis to a meeting at the Magic City Go-Go Bar, where he ordered them to assassinate Detective Tammy Early and Detective Michael Holly of the Portsmouth Police Department. In addition, he wanted FBI Special Agent Thomas Blades killed. He indicated that he was trying to find out the name of the U.S. attorney in charge of the case, and that when he did, he said, "I want him dead too." Stitt went on to tell Ortega that he was aware of the investigation because several deputies he knew and had paid off in the jail were present when Early, Holly, and Blades talked to prisoners about him. He provided Ortega with the home addresses of Detectives Early and Holly and FBI agent Blades. Stitt obtained the addresses from contacts he had in the DMV. During the debriefing, Ortega recalled that Detective Holly lived in Portsmouth on Amherst Lane and that Detective Early lived in Chesapeake, but he couldn't recall her address. Ortega said that he and Davis fully intended to carry out the hits, but were arrested before they could do so. He and Davis spent many hours surveying both Holly and Early, looking for an opportune moment to kill them. They knew, for example, that Holly lived near Hardy's restaurant and would buy his coffee there every morning. They planned to do a drive-by shooting while he was at the drive-up window. Shortly after Ortega and Stitt were arrested, they were in a U.S. Marshal's van being transported to the federal courthouse for a hearing when Stitt told Ortega that he now knew the prosecutor's name, Fernando Grone. He said he was going to arrange to have Grone killed. One of their co-defendants riding in the van, Kermit Brown, spoke up and said, "That won't do you no good, man. They just put another one in his place. They have hundreds of them." Death slowly nodded his head and said, "Yeah, you may be right." The trial lasted for 2 months. In the end, all 8 defendants were found guilty by a 12-member jury. After the trial, AUSA Grone subpoenaed Jeff Lewis and Officer Tony to testify at the death sentencing hearing for Stitt. He wanted them to tell the jury about the Amico gas station double murder and about the Boobie Boys organization in general. They flew to Norfolk and each testified for over 4 hours. At the hearing, Stitt's defense attorneys presented what they called mitigating reasons why Stitt should not be executed, which included the victims consented to the criminal conduct that resulted in their deaths. The other factors in the defendant's background or character mitigate against the imposition of the death sentence. Richard Thomas Stitt was subjected to a dysfunctional family setting in childhood. Richard Thomas Stitt was abandoned and neglected as a child. Richard Thomas Stitt was deprived of the parental guidance and protection which he needed as a child. There are factors in Richard Thomas Stitt's background which demonstrate that mercy should be considered. The hearing testimony lasted 5 days, and the jury deliberated for 3 days before unanimously recommending that Stitt be sentenced to death on each of the 3 counts of homicide. Following the jury's recommendation, the district court sentenced Stitt to death on each of his 3 convictions for murder under the federal drug kingpin statute. In addition, Stitt was sentenced to a total of 780 months, 65 years, to be served consecutively for his 2 convictions of using and carrying a firearm during and in relation to a crime of violence, and for his 2 convictions of using and carrying a firearm during and in relation to a drug trafficking crime. Death was sentenced to death. How ironic. Ortega did in fact testify against Stitt during the trial, and because of his cooperation, the feds waived the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. Further cooperation resulted in his release in 2020. Following the death sentence, Stitt's attorney Norman Malinsky reached out to Officer Tony with a proffer, hoping for a Rule 35 for his client. He called Fernando Gron a runaway prosecutor with no heart. In the proffer, Stitt admitted his involvement in the murders of Tyrone Tarver and Roger Davis at the Amoco gas station. He also claimed to know who killed Benny Brownlee, Walter Betterson, Derek Harris, and many others he said we didn't know about. He said he would testify against Boobie. When Officer Tony told Prosecutor Chris Clark about the offer, his reply was, "Absolutely not. We are making no deals with admitted and convicted killers." Officer Tony agreed wholeheartedly. Nard Brown was caught fleeing from the parking lot of Coco's Lounge, a strip club on Northwest 119th Street. Miami-Dade police officers were dispatched to a disturbance call, and he ran when they pulled up. He was found hiding behind a house in a nearby residential neighborhood and charged with resisting arrest. 3 other men ran at the same time, and 2 handguns were dropped on the asphalt as they fled. Nard gave a false name when he was booked into the Miami-Dade County Jail, but his fingerprints connected him to the first-degree murder warrant for the shooting death of John Davis. His twin brother, Bo Brown, may have been one of those who fled and got away. A short article about his apprehension appeared in the Miami Herald. The Brown brothers are wanted in connection with the slaying of John Davis, who was gunned down on February 24th outside a market on Northwest 79th Street. Police said the Browns forced 4 people to the ground at gunpoint. Davis was killed and another man was wounded. A third was shot at but escaped injury. Karen Mills Francis, lawyer for the Browns, did not return phone messages. She has previously denied they were involved in the slaying of Davis. Karen Mills Francis was the Boobie Boys' lawyer, spokesperson, and denier-in-chief. Whenever anyone in the group was accused of any type of criminal activity, she would vociferously deny it. When the Mother's Day article came out in the Miami Herald, reporter Gail Epstein asked her about the gang, and her reply was typical. Karen Mills Francis, lawyer for several alleged players in the Boobie Boys, said she had never heard of the gang's name before a reporter asked her about it. "They're called the Boobie Boys? Let me write that down," she said. Mills Francis denied that Boobie Williams heads a gang. She said her clients, the Browns twins, did not know anything about the murder police are seeking them for. She complained the FBI is so eager to take down Williams that agents used Gestapo tactics against a former client of hers to try to force him into becoming a government witness. Karen Mills Francis was born and raised in Miami. The oldest of 5 children, she was valedictorian of her high school class and accepted a full scholarship to the prestigious Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, where she received her bachelorette degree. She graduated from the Levin School of Law at the University of Florida in 1987 and began her legal career at the Miami-Dade County Public Defender's Office. Eventually, she moved into private practice. She shared an office on Biscayne Boulevard with another defense attorney, Larry Handfield, who was a former prosecutor under Janet Reno. In 2000, Karen Mills Francis ran for judge. She beat the longtime incumbent, becoming only the second black woman in history to serve on the bench in Miami-Dade County. She won another term, and in 2008, she resigned to accept the starring role in the television series Judge Karen, a knockoff of other court shows such as The People's Court and Judge Judy. She presided over small claims court cases as an arbitrator and proclaimed at the start of each show, Justice isn't always black or white. The show was produced by Sony Pictures Television and lasted only one season, but episodes can still be seen today on the BET network. In 2009, Mills Francis was featured in another court show called Judge Karen's Court. Judge Karen's Court, like Judge Karen, was axed after one season. In 2013, Entertainment Studios agreed to produce Supreme Justice with Judge Karen, which became moderately successful and was still in production in 2021. But the ascendancy of Karen Mills Francis from defense attorney to judge to television personality was nearly derailed by her involvement with the Boobie Boys. On July 1st, 1998, a federal grand jury was impaneled to hear evidence exclusively for the CCE case pertaining to the Boobie Boys and Vonda's gang. Officer Tony was the first witness to testify. He laid out what he knew thus far and what they hoped to achieve. A federal grand jury consists of 16 to 23 members, randomly selected from a list of registered voters. The federal grand jury meets behind closed doors and conducts its business in secret. Violations of the grand jury secrecy rules are strict. There is no presiding judge. Only the jurors, the prosecutor, and the witnesses are allowed in the jury room. The defendant has no right to be present or to even be informed that he or she is the subject of an investigation. Refusal to testify in front of the grand jury can result in a contempt charge. The North End Task Force had spent 6 months trying to decide which witnesses merited an appearance before the grand jury. They traveled to numerous federal prisons, including Atlanta, Lewisburg, Coleman, Allenwood, and Leavenworth penitentiaries, conducting interviews, trying to establish who were the strongest witnesses and which ones to reject. Eventually, the travel was curtailed, and the witnesses were brought to the task force. Chris Clark signed writs ordering the U.S. Marshal Service to transport the prisoners who were potential witnesses to Miami. The Marshals have a unique method for preventing escape plots. It is known as diesel therapy. The inmate is not given any notice that he will be traveling. He is simply told, pack your shit, and put on a bus or plane and taken to another facility where he is temporarily housed for a day or days. He is then again told to pack your shit and taken to another facility. This can go on for weeks. The process is intended to confuse the inmate and not allow him to plan an escape with any of his Confederates on the outside. A trip to Miami, for example, might start in Atlanta with a flight to Minnesota, then to Oklahoma, then to Indiana, then a bus ride to Illinois, and finally a flight to Miami. The inmates hated it, and it would be the first thing they complained about whenever they were interviewed. By the fall of 1998, the house of cards that was the Boobie Boys organization had completely collapsed. It had proven to be a flimsy structure built on the loyalty of its members, and the tensile strength of that loyalty was unexpectedly weak. The same was true for Vonda's gang. Both groups were in total disarray. They had more informers and cooperators than they knew what to do with. The Mother's Day article in the Miami Herald had been a boon to the investigation and produced collaborators for them, both on the streets and in the prisons, who were willing to talk. Vonda, Famous Johnson, Vonda's sister Coco, Pukalata, E4, Chico, Shoutout, Fat Wayne, Vinny, and Moose were in custody on federal firearms and drug charges. Nard and Death had been arrested for murder. Fish Grease was dead, and Boobie and Bo Brown were on the run. Not bad for a start. One of the sources they relied on was a 20-year-old female named Nettie. She called the homicide office one day asking for Officer Tony because his name was mentioned several times in the article in the Herald. She said she was one of Boobie's many girlfriends. She had 3 kids, and she thought Boobie might be the father of the youngest. Nettie confided that Boobie was worried. He had read the indictments for E4 and the twins and told her, "The cops know too much. Somebody is working for the cops. I don't know how they know all of this. They know everything." He went on to tell her that he had hired 2 good lawyers and that the first thing the lawyers said to him was, "This isn't going to be cheap. Can you afford us?" He told Nettie he laughed in their faces and said, "Yeah, I can afford you." The attorneys then explained to him how to funnel money to them through friends and family members by making a bunch of payments that would not raise any red flags. He went on to tell her that he might try and run to Atlanta and that he had already made arrangements for plastic surgery, but he knew that it was over. He acknowledged he would probably be going to jail for the rest of his life and said pensively, "If I could only kill Rara, I could go to jail happy." When they received information that Robert Sawyer, Rara, had fled back to Tallahassee, Officer Tony contacted a United States Marshal he knew named Harry Lane, who worked in the Florida Panhandle. Officer Tony told him they had open federal warrants for Rara and his wife Andrea for firearms violations. Harry said he was very familiar with Rara. Just two weeks earlier, a man named Alexander Ray King, aka Bama, had been shot and killed at the Moon Bar in Tallahassee on what was known as Urban Ladies Night. Bama owed money to Rara for narcotics, and the shooter in the homicide was Henry Lee Dickey, a cousin of Rara's wife. The day after the murder, Rara threatened Bama's girlfriend, telling her that even though Bama was dead, the debt was still owed, and she would be killed if it wasn't paid. Within a few days, Harry called to tell Officer Tony that both Rara and his wife were in custody in Macon, Georgia. Everyone on the task force assumed that Rara would be hardcore and never talk to them. He had a reputation as a stand-up guy because he did his 10-year stretch for the contract killing of McBride without implicating Vonda. But this was different. He knew this was bad. He was facing life in prison. He had his ear to the street, and he knew other people were talking. So, 2 days after his arrest, he contacted his lawyer and told him he wanted to make a deal. An agreement was hammered out quickly with his attorney, Clyde Taylor. Rara said he wanted to tell his side of the story. Yes, he had done some bad things, but the Boobie boys were always trying to kill him. Sergeant Dave Simmons and Detective Mike Hernandez flew to Macon to hear his version. It took a while for him to get on board, but when he did, he was all in, and he admitted to most of what he had done. He was reluctant to discuss the murders, particularly that of Marvin Rogers, but he did indicate that if his wife was released on bond, she might know the location of the murder weapon. Dave and Mike took several sworn taped statements from Rara, in which he fully admitted his participation with Vonda in the narcotics business. He also gave detailed statements describing how he had been shot multiple times by the Boobie boys. For the first time in his life, he was willing to identify his attackers and prosecute them. Mike Salas, the assistant United States attorney prosecuting the Sawyers, was accommodating. He agreed to ask for a low bond for Andrea Sawyer, and true to his word, Rara instructed her to turn over the HK.223 rifle that was used to kill Marvin Rogers. Ballistics testing would later confirm that it was one of the murder weapons. They couldn't find Boobie or his cousin Bo Brown, so Officer Tony called Cindy Smith, one of the producers at America's Most Wanted, the television show hosted by John Walsh. She agreed to produce a segment to try and help them capture them. The episode aired on Saturday night, September 26, 1998, and was narrated by John Turchin. It was an exceptionally well-done piece and accurately depicted the drug war that had been raging on the streets of Miami for nearly a decade. Detective Joe Mallett flew to Washington, D.C., where the show originated, and represented the task force as it was broadcast live. Joe helped man the tip line during and after the show. An anonymous call came in that claimed Bo Brown was hiding out in the Panhandle in Gretna, Florida, where he had family. According to the tipster, Bo's father, known only as Top Cat, lived there and was concealing him. Joe called the Gadsden County Sheriff's Office in Quincy, and within hours, Bo was in handcuffs. He had a .32 caliber pistol and $2,500 in cash with him when he was arrested. A receipt found in the Chevy Impala Bo was driving indicated he had purchased $250 worth of rap CDs from a store the day before. When Gadsden County detectives talked to the clerk, she identified pictures of both Bo and Boobie and said they were in the store together. An article in the Miami Herald the next day said, "The arrest was another victory for law enforcement officers trying to bring down the Boobie Boys and Vonda's gang, two violent drug organizations battling for control of Miami's drug market." Now that both of the twins, Bo and Nard, were finally in custody, the murder case against them could proceed. After 3 days of testimony from 4 eyewitnesses, the jury deliberated just over 2 hours and returned verdicts of not guilty on all 6 counts. It was a shocker, but they soon found out why there had been an acquittal. In the Miami Herald article, Karen Mills Francis, their attorney, said they were falsely accused, which is what I have always said from the beginning. In her closing argument, Mills Francis attacked the prosecutor's witnesses as gypsies, tramps, and thieves who were more interested in cutting their own deals than in telling the truth. As it turned out, she was apparently the unscrupulous one. A key witness at the trial alleged that Mills Francis paid him to change his testimony. In a deposition, his entire story changed, and he recanted his identification of the twins as the shooters. He later told investigators that Mills Francis had paid him $260 to lie. During the trial, he reverted back to his original testimony, but the damage had been done. He had given 3 different versions, and jurors did not like that. "Ridiculous," Mills Francis said in an interview in the Miami Herald. "I did not pay him a dime." Later in the same interview, though, She acknowledged that she had paid the witness cab fare on several occasions. The acquittal of the twins forced Officer Tony's hand. They couldn't let them back out onto the streets, so they charged them with the attempted murders of Rara and assorted narcotics violations. Prosecutor Chris Clark was concerned about the cozy relationship Karen Mills Francis had with the Boobie boys. In a motion to the court, he sought to have her barred from defending any of the Boobie boys during the upcoming CCE. He cited what he called an obvious conflict of interest. He even went as far as to say that Mills Francis herself might become a target of the investigation, or, at the very least, a material witness because of her vast knowledge of the organization. In his brief, Chris wrote, "Via this motion, the government has notified Attorney Mills Francis of her status as a subject before an ongoing grand jury investigation related to the activities on behalf of Leonard Brown and others." He also issued a grand jury subpoena for Mills Francis, ordering her to appear at the next session. One of the requirements of the subpoena was that she bring all her fee records pertaining to the Boobie boys. That night, Officer Tony delivered the subpoena to her home in the northeast section of Miami-Dade. When he formally served her with the summons, she angrily snatched it from his hand and slammed the door in his face. When the time came for her to testify before the grand jury, she refused. She invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. After some bartering, she revealed that her reluctance to testify stemmed from a $30,000 payment she had received from the twins' mother. She had not claimed the money on her income tax or informed the IRS of its source. It was an act of omission, not evasion, she said. When asked if she knew the source of the $30,000, she said the twins' father told her he had won the money gambling, and she believed him. Several weeks later, Officer Tony was standing in the homicide break room, pouring a cup of coffee, when Joe Mallet walked in behind him. "You're not going to believe this, Sarge," he said. "SRT has Karen Mills Francis's house surrounded. Apparently, her husband has threatened to kill her, and shots have been fired." By the time Officer Tony got there, it was all over. Her husband, Arthur Francis, had taken her hostage and had shot at the SWAT team when they surrounded the house. Negotiators tried to reason with Francis, but he ended up killing himself with a single gunshot to the head. Officers told Officer Tony Mills Francis was injured but not severely. He scanned the scene and spotted Karen sitting in the back of a fire rescue vehicle being attended to. As he watched her sobbing, he actually felt sorry for her. This is the end of The Boobie Boys, Part 5. See y'all next time.
Treatment.